Hi, my name is Leanne Schneider-Webb, and I'm the programming librarian at Bexley Public Library. In the background, I have my colleague, Josh Bryant, and he's the technology librarian at Bexley Public Library. And you are joining us tonight for the author talk with David Giffels, Barnstorming Ohio. I would like to introduce our speaker, our author this evening, David Giffels. David, called The Bard of Akron by the New York Times, has written 6 books of nonfiction, including the critically acclaimed memoir, Furnishing Eternity, A Father, a Son, a Coffin, and a Measure of Life, in 2018. His previous books include The Hard Way on Purpose, Essays and Dispatches from the Rust Belt, which was a New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice and a nominee for the I should have practiced saying that, Diamonstein-Spielvogel Award for the Art of the Essay, and the memoir All the Way Home, winner of the Ohioana Book Award. A former Akron Beacon Journal columnist, his writing has appeared in the New York Times Magazine, The Atlantic, Parade, The Wall Street Journal, Esquire, Grantland, The Iowa Review, and many other publications. He also wrote for the MTV series Beavis and Butthead. Okay, and we just really quickly want to remind everyone that we will be muting everybody and making sure that their cameras are off for the duration, just to keep things going smoothly. His awards include the Cleveland Art Prize for Literature, the Ohio Arts Council Individual Excellence Award, and a General Excellence Award from National Society of Newspaper Columnists. He was selected as the Cuyahoga County Public Library Writer-in-Residence for 2018-2019, and Giffels is a professor of English at the University of Akron, where he teaches creative nonfiction in the Northeast Ohio Master of Fine Arts program. David, take it away.
Thank you, Leanne. Let me just adjust my view here. Okay. Hang on, I've got a weird view. Okay, thanks, Leanne, and welcome to my my porch, where Bob Ellington and I are sitting and doing I think the tail end of the strangest book tour of my life. But I'm really glad to be able to do this in conversation. First of all, I'm glad for all of you to join us in the middle of a summer evening when you could be having gin and tonics on your veranda or bird watching or something. So thanks for being here. But I'm really glad to be able to do this in conversation with Bob Ethington, because Bob's been such a big part of my life as a writer, as well as being a dear friend. Bob recently retired as the manager of the Department of Popular Culture and Audio Visuals at the Akron Summit County Public Library. And while he was there, he was a champion not just of local authors, but also a force to be reckoned with in bringing in nationally recognized authors such as George Saunders, Chuck D, Amy Sedaris, and Anne Lamott, and had this amazing series, writers series, that was really an inspiration for readers and writers in Summit County. And I think every book I've written except one had its launch at the Akron Summit County Public Library with Bob as the host, and in fact sometimes in conversation with Bob. So I feel like we are sort of like on the victory lap of Bob's career, bringing him out of his recent retirement to join us here. So this is Bob, and Bob, why don't you pick it up from here and talk about how we started the Barnstorming Ohio book tour?
Well, I mean, the first thing to be said is that with all this post-pandemic world that we're in, this is actually the first time you and I have been together in person. I think it's since I retired in October of last year, 2020. But we did a program for kicking off Barnstorming Ohio, which was very late August or early September.
Yeah, right around Labor Day.
Yeah. And at the time, a lot of what was fascinating about David's book was that he had done this major research on and driving around literally the entire state, interviewing people throughout Ohio. And about their social conditions, their economic conditions, their political thoughts. And of course, one of the things I think that was probably in your mind was when you were writing the book is that Ohio had this reputation as being a bellwether state, this state that kind of like chose presidents, right? And of course, that's not the case for the way the election turned out in 2020. I'm just curious if you think Ohio still has that status as a bellwether state.
Yeah, it's a tricky question because I think a lot of times bellwether and swing state get confused or used interchangeably, and they're not. And the premise, the premise of this book's mission was that I believe and believed as I was beginning this project that Ohio always has something to say that's authentic about America and has a unique, sort of represents a unique cross-section of America in a way that, as I quantify kind of in the book, that no other state really has because we have such a diverse population. And we had this track record up until this past election of having accurately selected the president in 29 of the previous 31 elections.
Right.
We're still 29 for 32, which is still a pretty good number. But
not a bad record.
So the premise of the book project was to set off across Ohio, kind of at the grassroots level, and just to talk to people who I felt would offer a representation of where we were as a country. And this was done primarily in 2019 into early 2020, and then see what that all added up to. So when the election happened, and it's interesting, yeah, like you said, we had this conversation before the election. You know, I don't think I'm being hyperbolic when I say a lot of dramatic events have happened since this book came out shortly before the election. So, and one of them is that all of a sudden Ohio is seen as staunchly red and no longer this bellwether and no longer sort of in play in national elections and even statewide. And that's where that swing state, bellwether state divide, I think, is important, at least for my context, because, you know, whether we are a swing state or not, or whether gerrymandering has anything to do with that, and that's a separate conversation. I still feel that our status as a bellwether, as an authentic representation of the country, as a representation of a lot of different parts of the American psyche, collectively exists here, and that hasn't changed. You know, in the last 6 months, I don't think it's changed in the last few decades. We still have a lot to say about what's happening in the country, but I think we're going to be listened to in a different way now because a lot of people are seeing us as a red state.
It is a question. With what your comments, you kind of are jumping ahead in some of my later questions I had, but I'll jump around with you. So do you think Ohio has become a more divided state, or is that maybe is it representing the entire nation? And just to your point.
Yes and yes. I think it has, and I think the thing that's, I think, been frustrating for me more than anything else in the past 6 months or so is my optimistic spirit and sort of a guiding principle that I wanted this book to prove is that we are all more alike than different. And that's why I wanted to talk to people from all different, not just political stripes, but just all different walks of life. And to try to confirm that partly for myself, but also, you know, as a matter of hope. And it's really hard to think about America that way right now, because as soon as you state your politics, or as soon as you state like whether you got a vaccine or not, or if you walk into public wearing a mask, like all of these things immediately become dividing, you know, sort of a very binary dividing parts of a human being, which is still a whole complex thing, but we aren't allowed, it seems like, publicly and on social media to let those things happen. so I feel like, yes, we are as divided as the country, and in that regard, we represent the larger picture of the country by the way we are divided. I know, like in my own family, that the politics of who voted for who was really uncomfortable. It's always there's always been some discomfort, but a different kind of discomfort, where like I can't even talk to some family members about politics, or if I do, we have to almost set ground rules, even in social conversation.
No punching in the face.
Yeah.
Rules like that. Okay.
So it's we're just.
Well, and that does. I don't want to get too deep into just the machinations of politics in Ohio, but since you touched on this, I do wonder if gerrymandering is an issue in Ohio, and of course they're trying to theoretically repair that, because one of the things when you listen to national coverage of the entire country, what increasingly comes out is that, well, okay, there's the Northeast, right? There's New York, there's Connecticut, there's Vermont. Those are all Democratic states. There's California on the west, whatever. And then there's all these states in the middle that are far from that worldview. And that's kind of what we have in Ohio. I mean, we're in Akron, we're in Summit County in Ohio, and it's kind of like from where we are, literally if you go down to Kent, it's different. Right? If you drive 30 miles south from us, it is a very different political landscape. From us north, and particularly up to Cleveland and to the east, it is very Democratic. But I think that a lot of those people do not feel represented in our state government right now. So, that has to be addressed, right? Or there's going to be a problem.
Yeah, it does. Well, first of all, I'm not a political scientist, so I learned a lot about politics writing this book. And I have said from the start that this is a political book, but it's not a book about politics. Right. But nonetheless, it's important to understand, if you want to understand Ohio, that it is one of the most gerrymandered states in the country, and its political map doesn't represent its social map. I think the part of the state that is most interesting to me, and I think to political scientists too, is Trumbull County, which kind of goes to what you were just talking about. Trumbull County, much like Summit County where we are, and Cuyahoga County where Cleveland is, Northeast Ohio, was traditionally this sort of reliably blue collar, Democrat voting, union driven sort of political dynamic. And Akron and Cleveland have stayed that way, and Youngstown has not. Right. And Trumbull County and the surrounding areas, the Mahoning Valley, have turned that, went for Trump in 2016 and again in 2020 in a way that is still baffling people. In fact, a few days after the election, I was doing a panel on Zoom with, and Sherrod Brown was one of the other panelists, and we had an opportunity to ask each other some questions. And this is the weekend after election day, and I said, "What happened in Trumbull County?" Thinking Sherrod would know the answer, and Sherrod's like, "We need to find out, because I don't know either." And so if he doesn't understand it, I think this is an important thing. And I've been watching Tim Ryan's race closely, because Tim Ryan really understands that area. And he explained it, and it's in the book, he explained it to me in a way that I hadn't understood it before, that these are people who aren't listened to. These are people who have been told things by politicians and by corporate leaders and by people in power for so long, and they've tried to cling to a way of life and a sense of self-control. And a lot of that had to do with the massive Lordstown plant. It was GM. It's now they're trying to reinvent as an electric car plant, and it's not making it. It's not filling the void. And so the sense of powerlessness is growing and growing and growing. And people who feel that and are angry and hurt, those are people who want to understand. Some county are stable enough that I think we can, sort of like expect it to kind of stay with its trend, and it's different there.
Well, okay, you touched upon a couple of things. We get to Tim Ryan in a second, and also more about specifically Lordstown, but there was also a very famous politician that comes from that area who you write about quite interestingly in Barnstorming, Ohio.
Yeah.
And would you care to expound on that particular person?
Yeah, Jim Trafficking,
who seems like he's maybe a little ahead of his time in a
yeah,
way.
one of the things I've done this entire book tour this way, so I've never gotten to be in front of a live audience like talking about the book.
Right.
And I've just like, because I have in my mind like how, if I say the name Jim Trafficking, I kind of know like the generation that will have a firsthand memory of Jim Trafficking, and then others who maybe have heard, and so I like want to sense the room. But Jim Trafficking, for those of us who remember him, was this bigger than life, flamboyant outsider in Washington who was a congressman from Northeast Ohio, and he served in the 1980s. And
famous hair.
And he was outspoken. He was profane. He sparred with the media. He had a weird hairdo with an ill-fitting suit, and he was a populist. And as soon as Trump came into the political view, he was started to be talked about as like the proto-Trump. He was kind of like, even though he was a Democrat, he had a lot of. And even though he was lowborn and Trump was highborn, other than those facts of his life, a lot of his political life predicted Donald Trump.
Yeah.
And in great part because it was unlikely that he would end up in Washington, and he did, and he stayed for a long time. And even after he was expelled from Congress and in prison, he continued to run for his congressional seat. And like 18,000 people would vote for him. That's a lot of people to vote for a convict who was expelled from Congress. And so much of this just continues to match up with him. Plus, he was so much fun to write about. I mean, there was not a single quote in my research that wasn't just like, I waited my whole life as a journalist to get quotes like this, because he was everything he said, everything people said about him, and it was just one time he was in the halls of Congress. He called the IRS a bunch of prostitutes, and then he looked into the camera and he said, "And I apologize to all the prostitutes of America for putting you in the same bag as the IRS." It was so much fun. But also what about him was either could help us understand the Trump phenomenon or serve as a warning, because there was one political columnist at the Youngstown Vindicator, whose name is completely escaping me, as happens at a certain age. But he covered trafficking for his whole political career, and Bertram D'Souza was his name. And near the end, and in the end, when he was running for office from prison, he said, "This is a warning. This is somebody who has committed a crime, and you're continuing to vote for him. This is what populism can do when it goes bad."
Right.
And so he was like the sort of the one sort of like voice of caution in that. And the chapter ends, there's this great poignance that here was the local newspaper serving its watchdog function, and that was part of the story. And as I'm writing this chapter, it's announced that the Youngstown Vindicator's print edition is ending, and in fact the paper is going out of business. This is the other warning of the importance of local journalism and what can be lost. Is the watchdog that protected us from a corrupt politician. Right.
We had, just as an aside, I don't remember if you were there or not, David, but we had at the Akron Public Library a film festival. We were tied in with the Cleveland Film Festival, which is a pretty big deal up here. And one of the films that was shown was a documentary on trafficking. And it was very interesting because people came from Youngstown to see, it was the movie was being shown just in Akron, and people came for it, and they had like these cards pinned, like these little badges with his face that looked like prayer cards. I mean, they were really literally like sort of icons. And the documentary, I guess you'll just have to trust me on this, I felt was very fair. I mean, it presented his flaws, but it also presented his accomplishments and, you know, speaking for working people, whatever. But it was very interesting because the people after that, of course, they all have to sign cards about, you know, what they think of the movie.
Right.
And it was radically divided. And people that had come from Youngstown were like, this movie's a smear job. I mean, it was very
and some
reminiscent of where politics has gone just a couple of years later.
Some of that is so important to what I was after with this book is part of the reason Trafficking has so much support was because he was speaking for people who feel like they're not being listened to.
Right.
And there was so much about my experience writing this book is that those are the people that we need to listen to, the ones who feel like they're not being listened to, because look at how they're becoming a political force.
Right.
And in some ways a dangerous political force, because if you can't be heard, and all of a sudden a bunch of people are storming the Capitol,
Yes.
and you're getting attention for it,
Right.
and you feel like you've been not listened to for a long time, look how it spills over in a very ugly, historically ugly way.
Right.
So that was, one of the things I was after. I want to point out, I just noticed something come in on the chat. I don't think we mentioned at the beginning that we're gonna talk until about 7:40, and then we want to open up a conversation. And so we'll continue to chat and then open up to questions. And I think Leanne is going to take questions from the chat and pose them to us. So we'll be glad to take those as well.
So one of the chapters in your book, which is one of the most poignant chapters, is about Lordstown, and you just kind of addressed it a little bit. I had read this stuff about them trying to refit the factories there for electric cars, and I thought that was really hopeful. You're saying it's not working?
Well, it's great on paper because one thing Ohioans do is reinvent ourselves. We when you're in a Rust Belt state.
Well, and isn't the automobile industry apparently trying to reinvent themselves too? Like
Absolutely.
They're basically saying we're going to electric cars, so that's the future.
Yeah, it should be, and if the Mahoning Valley becomes the Electric Valley, that's I think Voltage Valley is that's an awesome catchphrase. I want that T-shirt. If it works, it's going to be great. But this company, Lordstown Motors, that's been trying to create this electric truck, like a bit full-size truck. They just fired their top, like the CEO and the top people in the company. They're desperate for capital. A lot of what they're trying to do is doesn't seem to be gaining traction. And I haven't reported this firsthand. This is from what and this is just in the past few weeks.
Right.
And I know like about a week ago, amidst all of this, they opened up the plant to the press, and they brought in a bunch of reporters to try to generate some positive
I guess it's
press. And I'm really pulling for them. I'm really hoping this happens. But I'm also, the story of the Mahoning Valley is a story of coming back from big hits, from when Youngstown Sheet and Tube closed down in 1977, Black Monday, and that's still, those words are still spoken this day with hurt and dark reverence, because it's so many families were decimated by the shutdown of this giant steel plant, and so it was the Lordstown GM plant that kept their economic stability and their relevance alive. And when that shut down, there's only so many things, steps that you can fall back onto without tumbling all the way down. And so I'm really, hoping that this happens. And GM, separate from the Lordstown Motors project, GM has opened a battery plant in Lordstown, but we're talking about hundreds of jobs where there were thousands of
Right,
jobs
right,
lost.
Right. Have you, I mean, we're still sort of obviously in early post-pandemic mode. Is Lordstown a place you'd want to revisit theoretically to write something about? Maybe?
Yeah, I had a lot on my summer writing agenda, and that's on it, but it's fourth on the list.
Okay.
But I definitely want to go back there because it's such a fascinating story. I mean, Youngstown is like, it's just this folk story. I mean, it's this amazing American story in and of itself. There's a reason Bruce Springsteen wrote a song about it. He called the song Youngstown. It's like, I don't need to think of a better title.
That's the chorus.
And just even writing about that song, which I do in the book, and the way it was received in Youngstown. This is again when you feel like you're voiceless. When when Bruce Springsteen writes a song about Youngstown, when this was the Ghost of Tom Joad tour,
Right.
when he came to Youngstown to the Stanbaugh Theater in November of 1995, I think, to play the concert on that tour. He was given the key to the city. He was the LA Times, famed LA Times rock critic Robert Hilburn went to the show to report on it because it was such a big deal. It is a big deal in the Rust Belt to be recognized on your own terms.
Right.
And so that's part of the fascinating story of them now is I refer to it as like the who's down in Whoville, like we are here, trying to get Horton to hear them, and they have to collectively put their voices together.
But you know what I think has changed a little bit is that someone like Springsteen, he writes that song, so these people are being heard. I'll bet I'm going to wager you that a lot of those people now view him as like this liberal snowflake who well, fine, he wrote this song, but whatever, he's, this multimillionaire, right? That's a lot of the worldview now, and it's an understandable one because of the economic inequality in the country. So, and no matter what you're saying, people are then going to come at you from, well, how rich are you, or what is your social status, or your, whatever your stake.
Well, but even at the time, and not to get too much of it down the rock critic rabbit hole, but Springsteen at the time had just really hit his commercial peak, and he was struggling as an artist with like, how can I maintain it? I forget what the quote is that's in the book, but he said, where does the rich man belong?
Mm-hmm.
And he was almost desperate to maintain his ties to real people or in authentic America. And so writing that song was important for him to make sure he still understood a certain kind of people, and it resonated with him then. And you wonder now, like, he was already on that cusp of, is he using us to his own ends, or is he trying to, really be John Steinbeck?
We'll get off that particular topic, except to say that I think that people used to look at Springsteen as their spokesperson and someone they identified with. And then when he became so hugely successful and so rich, I think he became the one who had the existential challenge of like, how am I going to be able to keep these connections? And I think it's like a losing game for him, because if he says anything that people don't agree with, and his politics tend to be liberal, then that's it. They can just wipe, they can just say, like, I don't need to hear what this guy has to say. Just kind of like with sports figures making comments on social things, just play the game. We don't want to hear what you have to say, right? So sing the songs, right? Yeah. So one of the chapters in the book is about breweries as a growing industry in Ohio. Now, I think has a twin-edged sword anyway, in terms of we're creating more alcohol outlets. Do you think we've reached peak brewery also? I mean, it is a good, I know this is a crazy question you probably weren't expecting, but it's kind of like, how many more craft breweries can they open? There's about 15 in Akron.
It seems like when the craft brewing thing began, it was like, the perfect spot for the craft brewery is an abandoned factory space. Like that's how you get your sort of, Rust Belt and come by it honestly. Well, we have so many abandoned factory spaces that it seems like, Ohio can continue to like sort of exponentially like house new ones.
Right.
But truthfully, I don't know. Like, it's funny because when I was,
That's the thing throughout the entire state.
yeah, I mean, I was reporting that as an economic story and as a cultural story and as an excuse to drink beer as part of my research. And I interviewed Rick Arman, who was a longtime beer columnist for the Akron Beacon Journal and has written 2 books about Ohio craft brewing.
Right.
And, you know, the first book he wrote was almost out of date by the time it came out because it was a survey of all of Ohio's craft brewers. And that was, I want to say 6 or 7 years ago. When I interviewed him in 2019, he's like, well, those numbers, I have to update all the numbers on the number of breweries. Right. And by the time the book came out, those numbers were. So I don't know when and how it will reach critical mass. I forget what, there's a wealthy somewhere in Summit County that I just heard is getting its first craft brewery. It's like I don't know how many times you can jump the shark until there's like no credibility left. But I don't know, they seem to be doing great.
Let me ask you one more question.
Everybody needed to drink.
Well, that is true. Let me ask you another question, as we're kind of getting close to question time here, it looks like. But this is a big question that your book could not have predicted because of when you wrote it. But of course, is the pandemic. I'm just curious about your thoughts about the effect of the pandemic on Ohio specifically. I mean, and it's, we're dealing with a Republican governor who has been viewed nationally as being very responsible and proactive in dealing with it. And yet he's being in attempts to impeach him from his own party within the state. So, and any other white, even beyond the political spectrum, any other comments you might have on the pandemic, Ohio? Yeah,
I went into this book knowing it was going to be done in exactly a year. I started reporting and writing in March of 2019, and my deadline to my publisher was March of 2020 because the book was timed to the 2020 election, so there was no wiggle room on the deadline.
Right.
So I had a very strong sort of game plan roadmap. But I didn't know how the book would end. And, I guess comedy is tragedy plus time. Who would have known that my dramatic ending would be handed to me in March of 2020 with the pandemic? So the book ends with the very beginning of the pandemic. Yeah. And so I was able to write about Amy Acton and Mike DeWine's early response, which was being lauded nationally, like over the top as forward-thinking, science-driven, the bellwether to follow.
Right.
And so that was the tone that the book ended on. And so in the year and plus since then, seeing how it's unfolded, a couple of things have struck me. One is, in a way, for me, this reinforces how and why Ohio is I think, a bellwether that's worth watching. And I think the main reason is because Ohio has been through so much in the past generation or two that our hard times are something to learn from. Mm-hmm. So the first thing is one reason that Ohio's response was being looked to as an example is because Amy Acton had such an active role as a science-driven advisor to the governor. Well, the last person that Mike DeWine selected for his cabinet, because he wanted to make sure he got the right person, was Amy Acton. And the reason it was so important that his public health director be the right person is because Ohio had been suffering from a major public health crisis, the opioid epidemic. Right. So Ohio was prepared for a major health crisis because of our hard times. And the right person was selected because he knew how hard those times were. The next thing that happened in the early waves and has continued till now is the major economic crisis that came on. Right. Well, if you want to learn how to get through the hard times of a major economic crisis, come to Ohio. We've been doing it for 30 years. And so, these factors that were being, that suddenly sprung upon the American populace had reflections of things that we had been through and kind of knew how to adapt to, crisis
Right.
or loss
Right.
is kind of part of what we do.
Right.
So to me, DeWine was thinking less as a politician and more as an Ohioan,
Mhm.
a lifelong Ohio,
Mhm.
and has continued to. And even, whatever anybody says about the Vax-A-Million thing, as soon as he did it, everybody started to copy it. It was kind of like another bellwether move that he made, and not like calculated, but it just seems like the country has looked to us
Right.
throughout. Now, that said, our vaccination numbers aren't really,
Right.
better than anywhere else, but
Right. They started strong, but
but to me, like Mike DeWine's leadership on it has sort of represented like somebody who's trying to do the right thing,
Right.
despite
Yeah.
the political factors
Right.
against it.
Right. So it looks like we're pretty close to time here for questions. We can continue gabbing if you
Yeah,
want
if the
to.
questions.
We do
How many-
have a few questions. If you're interested, I will go ahead and relay.
Sure.
And you also had a nice note in the chat, David. Someone thanked you for early Christmas shopping. They were able to buy your books for some friends or family members. So,
Well, thank you, person.
okay, so I'm gonna jump right in. One of the questions asks to David. You write that both the farmer you interviewed in Delaware County and the labor leaders in Lordstown put first the future, the long game. Do you believe that the woman from Hilliard, from the Women's March, and the owner of the bookstore in Mansfield agree with those, in quotes, representative men?
So I wasn't sure what the first part was that they would agree or disagree with.
I don't know either. We could ask for a little bit of clarification. That was from.
Let me let me.
Suzanne.
I don't have the chat open. Let me see if I.
Yeah. So it was asking the farmer that you interviewed in Delaware County and the labor leaders in Lordstown. I think they're saying that you wrote that they were talking about how they put the future first. They were thinking about the long
Right.
game. And then you interviewed a woman from Hilliard who was maybe involved in the Women's March.
Yeah.
And a bookstore owner in Mansfield. And they were wondering if you thought that those, like the woman from the Women's March in Hilliard and the bookstore owner would agree with the labor leaders in Lordstown.
Specifically with taking the long view and not
I think so.
the political moment. Yeah. I mean, I certainly wouldn't want to speak for anyone beyond what they told me, but but what I do understand about the person in Columbus whose name is escaping me at the moment. It's been so long since I've looked inside the book. But everything that she was doing, every passion that she had for politics and for a cause, Lacey Chivant is her name, and was driven by her young daughter. So she was certainly being driven by the long view, because it was much more that she wants to try to be active in her political life, in how she lives her own life, in how she makes whatever decisions she can make that can influence change for the benefit of her daughter. And that struck me as a father very strongly, because I realized one of the things I learned about myself as I was writing this book is that, and I really didn't think about this consciously until then, is that as my children are becoming adults, my political decisions are much more driven by them than by my own interests. And so I felt a real kinship with her, and I think she definitely takes the long game. So Leyland Fowler, who managed Main Street Books in Mansfield, I believe that she had the same long view. And very briefly, the long view of the farmer is that the farmer can never react into what happens in a given year, because it's so contingent on forces outside of the control, weather, politics, economic factors, and so forth. So they have to take the long view. So applying that to managing a bookstore in Mansfield, Leyland Fowler wasn't doing that as a job. She was doing that as a statement that a small town needs to support small local businesses that might not be major money makers, but that represent a kind of America that we still want to believe in, a small town Americana like Mansfield. Mansfield has a little park with a carousel right in the middle of downtown, which seems almost audacious in a downtown that's blighted in many ways. And so her long view was that if I can do one small thing that's never going to make any money, but to make a statement that a small bookshop in Mansfield, Ohio can be relevant, that I'm saying something that I'm telling the rest of America, this is what you want America to look like, then you have to put your money where your mouth is and not shop at the big online booksellers if you have the option of this. Well, the reality came home. The book came out in August. I was scheduled to do an event at Main Street Books in October, and Leyland contacted me in September, and she said, I hate to tell you this, but the bookstore is going out of business at the end of the month.
Oh my God.
So it was this canary in a coal mine moment where she was taking the long view, and the short-term economic effects of the pandemic just no longer could, the owner of the store just couldn't justify keeping it open. So we did get to scramble and reschedule and do the event this before the store closed.
Wow, and that's actually a really great tie-in to our next question, because you're talking about bookstores closing and of course, the online book marketplace, which the next question is actually about Amazon. You depict, so this is from the chat. You depict Amazon's construction of a fulfillment center in the abandoned mall in Akron and elsewhere as critical for Ohio's economic recovery. Alec McGillis tells more of the downside of Amazon's arrival in Ohio. If you have read McGillis's Fulfillment, would you speak to your sense of the long run effects of this kind of economic recovery?
I have not read that book. I do know of it, and it is so much of a mixed bag and full of compromises. I can tell you, as a resident of Akron, and as I write about in the book, what the blight, not just of that dead mall, but the whole area surrounding it, meant to Akron. It's just this public shame. And
it was like international shame.
Yeah, I mean, it was like, I forget which publication wrote about it when it was like America's worst dead mall.
Yeah.
Is this the Rolling Acres Mall?
Yes, this is Rolling Acres Mall.
Okay, I grew up in Akron, and I was like, "What mall are they talking about? Is it?" I don't think Chapel Hill is an Amazon fulfillment center. It must be Rolling Acres. Okay. I remember when that internet post went viral because people were taking like the abandoned mall pictures inside of it.
Right.
Anyway.
Yeah, and I actually interviewed the photographer who took some of those pictures, and so there isn't an answer to this question. The fulfillment center replacing the blighted public space is a positive. The jobs created not only for people who need jobs that pay as well as the Amazon jobs do, but in a part of the city where those jobs are needed most, and gives them those jobs is a plus. The conditions of the workplace of Amazon and the potential for sort of the Sinclair Lewis question of what's this going to mean more largely for an entire class of Americans is a potential minus. The carbon footprint of this constant delivery, is not, it's sort of a minus, but one of the things I write about in the book is that the paper industry was in crisis. Wisconsin has a huge paper industry, and there was a huge concern in Wisconsin that the paper, because so much is being done digitally now that people aren't mailing letters and printing newspapers and so forth. All of a sudden, Amazon comes with all these boxes, have revived the paper industry. So there's this vast effect of, of pluses and minuses that come out of that. So I can't answer the question. I know how excited people were here for the immediate Amazon, the shiny new thing replacing the old thing.
If I can just toss in one comment, I'll add this. I think this has all been, the whole Amazon phenomenon obviously has been exponentially exasperated by the pandemic, because I mean, a year ago you didn't see Amazon trucks driving around your streets every couple of hours. Now I do see it all the time. And because people were stuck in their houses, that's how they were buying not only books, they were buying everything online. And so it is, I do think it's a problem, but it's one that I think has just been exacerbated by recent events and how that all ultimately balance out. What to see. I don't know.
I don't think it's going to go.
It's not going to go away. It's not going to go away.
My son is deodorant from him.
Right.
He doesn't go to the drugstore.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, it's a huge question. Well, thank you for, attempting to even.
Yeah, it's a great question.
Yeah, it's a big question. And it's in the chat if anyone does want to read McGillis's Fulfillment. Our next question from the chat says, I'm in Central Ohio and appreciated the informative look at the entire state in this insightful book. It strikes me that grief and loss are dominant themes in the book, and a multifaceted definition of resilience emerges. David, what did you learn in this post-mortem analysis, and how can we take these observations to work toward less divisiveness and more cohesion while respecting our uniqueness?
I wish I had a profound answer to that. Because for a lot of my writing life, what I've written about is, what do we understand? I've written a lot about being a member of the first generation come of age I live in the northeast part of the state, which very much has a Rust Belt identity, in a place that never knew the heyday of the American boom and only knew its aftermath. And so my philosophy that I've developed from that is that we should see the great value in having lived through hard times, and the great value in seeing things that were well made fall into disrepair, and instead of throwing them away, and this is not just physical objects, but social, spiritual, psychological artifacts, pick them up and make new use out of them. The first people who go into blighted neighborhoods often are artists, because they have an eye for that which has been thrown away by people who think it's no longer useful. And all of that has kind of developed my way of thinking. And so, so in that way, I'm an optimist, because I always believe, that there's something to be learned from loss and pain, because we've known a lot of it, and so I want to maintain that optimism. But again, there's been no room for nuance in the national political and cultural conversation, and it's only getting worse. And I think another thing that the pandemic did is it drove us even further into our silos, where we were already living too much of our lives on social media, where we are very, very isolated in who and how we interact with other people. And this almost did all the more. I mean, look, I'm not in a room with other human beings. I can't read body language. And so, I might be offending the hell out of somebody right now with what I've been saying tonight. And I can't have the nuance of the conversation, or I can't, address it. And so I'm really worried with when I go back onto campus in the fall, and when we reemerge into the real social marketplace, what it's going to be, because it's the news outlets and social media have really poisoned the American conversation.
Wow. Well, that was definitely profound at the end there. Yeah.
relationship.
Yeah.
So I'm bringing the darkness now.
Yeah. I do want to, okay. I'm going to switch gears just really quickly a little bit. And if we could talk actually about the process of writing Barnstorming. So you've talked a lot about the actual content, and Bob was asking some pretty hard-hitting questions about it and the politics of it all and the politics of Ohio. But you were already a very, a published nonfiction author at this point. You're obviously you're a lauded journalist. And so who came up with the idea for the book? Was this something that your publishers approached you with? Was it something you wanted to do? And then how is it different of a process, if at all, from your other works?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's funny because I finished my previous book, Furnishing Eternity, when you mentioned in the introduction, when that book was reviewed in the New York Times Review, the reviewer referred to me as the Bard of Akron, which it made me cringe a little bit. I mean, I'm very proud of the writing I've done about my place, and it's the kind of writing I love to do. But I also felt like, especially at that point, I was just feeling like I wanted to go in a different direction. I wanted to do something completely different. And it wasn't that I didn't want to be pigeonholed as the Ohio writer or the Akron writer. I had a different idea, and I presented it to my agent, and it went nowhere. There was no. And so we were having a talk, and he's like, well, and this was right after the 2018 midterm elections. And he's like, and he's a lifelong New Yorker. And he's like, David, every time, these big elections come up and these cycles happen, it just seems like Ohio's at the center of the conversation. And he's like, I was a journalist in Ohio for 18 years. I've written all these different things about Ohio. He's like, you should just put on the David Ohio hat and just go, so Barnstorming Ohio, write a book about it. And so if you want to make God laugh, tell him your plan. So the guy who was just going to break away from the Ohio and do something different wrote a book where the biggest word on the cover. So, and as soon as he said it that way, I thought I was really I want to do that. I want to get on the ground and go. And the other thing he said is he said, if you don't do it, somebody else will. Well, I'm very competitive. So I did not want somebody else to write the Ohio
You
book.
are the Bard of Akron, not anyone else.
So, yeah, right. Yeah. So suddenly I wanted to own it. So that's how it came about. And then in terms of the process, I had been away from daily journalism for more than a decade by that time. And it was really invigorating. So it's one of the best writing experiences of my life was to do a very journalistic project on an intense deadline. I had to do the whole book from zero to finished in 1 year. And it was just that, I still had my teaching year to work around, but that's all I did. And I was completely immersed in it in a way that I haven't been with other books where I take time off and then come back to it, time off, come back to it, and work on the project. And so it had an intensity for me that was really exciting and electrifying. And it connected me with people who every single one of them humbled me and made me smarter. And I really mean that. They I talked to told me something that helped me understand. I mean, the subtitle of the book, I say it kind of winkingly, Barnstorming Ohio to understand America. Nobody can really understand America, but I really do feel like I understand America or Americans better for having done the project, especially in that way that really forced me into an engagement with, talked to more than 100 people for this book. And
wow. That's really incredible.
And I made my
and you made your deadline. Good. You and the pandemic. So we just have a few more moments. And so I think we would want to know, you had mentioned earlier in the discussion that you had summer writing projects and there were at least 4 of them. Are you able to tell us what is coming up for you? And then both to Bob and yourself, is there anything else you want our audience to know or anything else you'd like to plug before we sign off?
Sure. 2 of them I'm not talking about openly yet, because if I do, something will go wrong. But one thing I'm actively working on is I co-wrote a book about the band Devo from Akron. And it came out in 2003, it's out of print. And the University of Akron Press is going to reissue the book, but it's going to be much more visual because my co-author is an art curator and he has a vast collection of rare.
Who is the co-author?
Jay Dellinger. He lives in Tampa, but he's got all kinds of Devo memorabilia, song lyric sheets, photos that nobody's ever seen, all kinds of really, really cool. And it's such a visual band. So it's going to be more of a visual book with significantly revised from the
very awesome. And when is that supposed to come out?
And that's if it stays on schedule, it'll come out in fall of 2022 from the University of Akron.
Great.
And I will make sure that the Bexley Public Library has a copy circulation.
There you go. Yeah. Absolutely. Okay. Well, is there anything else either of you would like to plug or talk about or make sure we know about?
Well, not really. I guess the only thing I'll say is that as a recently retired public librarian, I think that the value of public libraries has been more accentuated and exhibited over this last year in a way that because libraries that were able to stay open, even if they were, dealing
hustling
with
curbside.
Right, the curbside and the drive-up windows and all that kind of stuff. So support your libraries. Ohio has a history fairly unique in the United States of supporting its public libraries at a state level and increasingly at local levels. So keep that up because it's a very important thing for everybody.
And I would be remiss not just to thank Bob, but to thank Leanne and the whole staff at Bexley.
Yes.
Independent bookstores and libraries support authors better than anybody else, and actively, and they engage an audience that we can't get anywhere else. And I know, speaking for all of Ohio's authors as well as America's authors, when I say that we couldn't exist without you. We appreciate you.
Well, thank you